Yo,
Is my voice all good? Like, loud enough?
it's kind of muffled and quiet. Is there any way you can get closer to your mic?
Is this any better?
That is a little better. Here, I can turn you up on my end. Say something.
Something.
What mic you're using? Integrated laptop mic, phone.
Honestly, just a random headphone mic. Like, I have a better mic, but that would take longer to get set up, and like, I can't really hear as well. If I do that.
I think yeah, okay. I think you sound good enough as long as you keep the mic at a steady distance from your mouth. All right, what's up?
All right. So I just want to start off by saying, I believe in libunity. I'm not like an ideologue. I respect a lot of leftists. I like your content and whatnot, but
Mhm.
I don't want to go off too much like jerking off or whatever. But I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on anarcho-capitalism, like as of now? What do you think about it? I know it's kind of an open-ended question, but
I mean, it sounds kind of mutually exclusive because anarchy is largely about destabilizing or like deconstructing power relations, and capitalism is about giving people the tools to lord over one another economically. It seems pretty, it seems pretty mutually exclusive. I don't really know. I've never had a conversation with an ANCAP or even a right libertarian that didn't end in them not being able to explain how the fuck their system would work in the real world.
okay, that's fair. I mean, I can understand that, but like honestly, I guess it comes down to how we define capitalism because I know generally a lot of people would consider capitalism to be private ownership of the means of production, but I find the biggest problem with this is like what exactly does private mean, right? I mean, in the context of a state, like we're talking about like minarchism, right? We're gonna have a state, and like public ownership means whatever the state owns, and private ownership is whatever. Let's say like I as an individual, I own, but like or not personal possessions, but like for commercial use or whatnot. But when there's no state, I mean, like everything pretty much has to be private property, right? And like that's the biggest contention I have. Because like
Well,
otherwise, what exactly is public property?
I mean, it could be collectively owned by the people in that society. No.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't mind that. Like I think that's just fine. But the biggest problem is if a state comes in and intervenes and says, okay, you have to give this much of a portion of your land to each individual in your land. I mean, at that point, then that's the state. If the state has the authority to say that, then that means they have to have some control over the land, right?
Well, you can have
Like
a
if you don't
government without a state. Just because you don't have a state doesn't mean you can't have agencies or communal bodies whose job it is to make sure that resources are equitably distributed, right?
I mean, wait. I mean, in the way I'm using state and government, I'm kind of using them interchangeably. But I see you draw a distinction there. So, what exactly would you say is a government versus a state?
It depends on how pretentious the anarchist you're asking is, but I understand that the state involves like things like borders and specific geopolitical jurisdiction and imperialism and like direct autocratic control of like the uh, sorry, the legitimacy of violence, whereas a government literally just means any kind of human organization. Technically, a family is a government structure. I mean, when you have like the parents
Huh.
who give rules to the children, that's a kind of like miniature governance. So that system, government isn't going to go anywhere. That's integral to human social behavior. It's the state that we want to get rid of. If you want to get rid of the state, that's fine and dandy, but I posit that there would still be organizations that would allow for the equitable distribution of resources.
Wait, but like that seems like a hyper specific definition of a state. I
Well,
mean,
it's an
I mean,
anarchist
like, and that's
definition,
like
yeah.
an over. Okay, I mean, I suppose, but the biggest thing is that I don't have a problem with the existence of government. Like, if a family can count, of course, I'm not going to ban families, right? But like, when I'm talking about government, I generally mean like a governing body over like an illegitimate authority over a certain chunk of land, right? Like, that basically what you said, right? It imposes certain laws on the people. It has the sole authority to or the sole monopoly on violence and whatnot and borders and so I guess I thought of the government as what you would think of as a state, but I mean in that sense, okay, fine.
Well, right. So, like, well, I have to ask you, what would your society look like, ideally?
Sure. I mean, honestly, like I in the modern day, it's a little bit tricky because after industrialization, shit changed so much, right? Like I would look at the Native Americans, I would look at that as an ANCAP society because there's no existence of a state. And of course, like the belief of what land ownership meant was a little bit, there was a cultural thing there, but otherwise, like land was quote unquote owned privately, right? And it was operated on by the community and people who live in it. But there wasn't a governing entity that like mandated that people each member of a tribe received this much of portion of equity in the whatever, right? Like there's no
Well,
structure like that.
I mean, they absolutely did, though. Yeah, native communities absolutely did have systems by which they would ensure the equitable, if not equitable, at the very least, then the reasonable distribution of resources. They had governments.
Yeah, sure.
The native council, I think, that that
Yeah.
existed before we ravaged the continent with plague, was like one of the most sophisticated governmental organizations of its time anywhere in the world. People didn't own land, that's true, and that was, I guess, a different way they viewed things socially, but they certainly weren't capitalist. The concept of capital didn't exist. If anything, they were more primitive communist, where they were able to achieve the underlying social principles of communism pre-industrialization.
I mean, not necessarily. I'm sure there's a good level of trade and other forms of interchange, right? Capitalism doesn't necessarily require like a full monetary system. Like for instance, you could talk about like a I suppose like you could have a capitalistic barter economy. This is where individuals own land, they use whatever resources they have, and like they individuals decide how much something should be valued, right?
Well, I think
Like or like you can
you're
negotiate
describing
that.
trade and barter, not capitalism. Like trade and barter have been around for as long as humans have been able to communicate with one another, right? But capitalism is a pretty modern economic system.
Okay, so like in
Oh,
that sense, like I generally just talk about capitalism as private ownership of land. That's probably the biggest criteria I have because I don't necessarily see the necessity of a full-fledged monetary system, right? Or like money printing or any of
so
that.
your definition of wait, but if your definition of capitalism is private ownership of land, then how could the natives have been capitalist if they didn't believe in the ownership of land?
I mean, but when I say ownership, I don't necessarily think you need to believe you're owning land. I just believe when you occupy a piece of land and you use it for commercial use, that's technically you owning the land.
But
So like for instance,
they
in
didn't have commercial uses in native
well, by
communities.
commercial use, like they were harvesting resources off of the land and using that for their own use, right? You don't necessarily have to use the land to,
So to you,
create a company or something like that. But
to you, capitalism is when land is owned but not owned, but used for commercial use. But commercial use just means when you're using. So capitalism is when people use land. I feel like
no,
we're
I think
engaging in
it's
a degree
private.
of reductivism here, where every human society to have ever
Okay,
existed is capitalist. You know.
okay, that's fair. Let me try to like a better definition. I'd say because I'm honestly more of an anarchist than I am a capitalist. The biggest reason I say I'm ANCAP and not ANCOM is in order to be an ANCOM, you need to enforce your will upon like everyone in the society, right? That's the biggest contention I have. So I guess I'm not so much of an ANCAP as I am against anarcho-communism, but I'm
Wouldn't
still an anarchist
wouldn't
in
an
that sense.
anarcho-capitalist society like degrade into neo-feudalism without a state to regulate corporations? It seems like they would essentially turn into little private warlords. I mean, not even to speak of defenses of
Well,
anarcho-communism, but anarcho-capitalism is definitely not a system free of coercion.
well, yeah, I mean, I'll acknowledge there's a degree of coercion, but like in that sense, like ANCOM can still fit under an ANCAP society, right? Like a group of people could form a commune and voluntarily participate in it, and that would sure that part would be an ANCOM society. But the thing is, you're not forcing everyone everywhere to participate in a commune, right? If I want to go off and I want to take a chunk of land around me and I want to use that to provide to produce goods and sell
What
them
if a
to other people who want
corporation
to buy
wants
it,
to take that land?
the corporation wants to take that land, then at that point it just comes down to there's going to be conflict, right? But like,
So who's going to win that conflict? The megacorp that owns the entire eastern seaboard, or an ANCOM commune?
and at that point, probably the corporation. I mean, I guess it
Right.
depends
So
on the
why would they
size.
ever let
But
there
like,
any be any collectively owned land anywhere on the planet?
okay, but what's the alternative, right? Because like what you're saying could like you're just saying you're bringing hypotheticals, but how can an income community sustain if like let's suppose there's like a capitalist revolution that just destroys entire community? Oh, how will it like that's like I can bring up a hypothetical and say that okay,
What is a
ANCAP
capitalist revolution?
I mean, a revolution against the commune, like to destroy the entire concept of
You
a
mean
commune,
so
right?
the whole world is like anarcho-communist, which doesn't mean the whole world is in a commune, by the way. Just a commune isn't like the only form of social organization in a communist society. So what would a capitalist revolution be like? Like what would that mean? Like where's the power and impetus coming from? What's the public will?
I mean, I suppose like the biggest thing is people refuse to participate in the system, right? Like, for instance, I mean, whatever, let's say, institutions that are in place require participation from the community as a whole, right? Under communism, because otherwise, what you're left with is individuals owning production, which essentially boils down to some form of a capitalistic system, right? I mean,
Right, but
can you
like
agree with
what
that?
would so like a monarchist coup would be like you have a royal bloodline and they assemble an army and they like attack because the army believes in the divine right of that leader to rule or whatever.
Okay, sure.
Right. So like with a capitalist revolution in a communist society, what like who would participate in this? Like why would a common worker who collectively owns the means of production, who participates in the communal system, why would they think, "Yes, life would be better off if I had less economic power. I worked for wages for another person who had more power over me."
Oh,
For
I think
probably
it's the
for
opposite
fewer
way around.
wages because they need to get my surplus labor.
I think it's the opposite way around. They wouldn't want to reduce themselves down to a worker. They want to own the means of production, right? They probably want to control other people around them. I mean, I think that's generally how humans have operated, like all of history, right?
So
Trying to gain power over other people.
it would
Like,
be
I
like
just
an
don't see how people voluntarily cooperate in the system where they're reduced down to a member of a commune,
But so
right?
it would be
They're
like an
naturally,
army of like a million people who all think they're going to be the CEO afterwards?
I mean, it's going to be decentralized, right? Like, the biggest thing is like communism requires willingness to participate, even though ANCOM kind of necessitates that everyone somehow participates. Like, I just
What
don't
do you
see,
mean
like,
what do you
otherwise,
mean
you
by
need to contradict.
participate?
I mean, be a part of the society and participate in the production of goods,
You
right?
have to in
Like,
cap if you don't in capitalism, you starve. In a capitalist society, you have to participate in society as well because if you don't, you starve. You need to earn the wage that is necessary to live, right?
not necessarily. Like, for I mean, I don't have to participate in another person's business, right? I could go off and I could find some way to capital. Like, I could see some resource and say, okay, I could, land, labor, capital, whatnot.
Like
Maybe I could produce my own labor. However, it is like I'm not forced
wait, but
participating in a
you're describing communism right now. Capitalism streamlines our economy in such a way that the diversification of labor requires that most people work very alienating jobs. The vast majority of people under capitalism aren't going to make their living carving chairs out of tree wood. But under communism, because the means of production are communalized, there's more time and opportunity for people to pursue those creative crafts if they choose to. The difference is that because people don't need a wage to survive, even if you chose not to participate, you wouldn't die. Whereas under capitalism, 99.9% of people who quit their job to go make a living off of underwater basket weaving end up having to go back to a job now poorer off than they were before because the economy doesn't reward that kind of diversification. Yo,
All right. Hello. Now am I a little bit better in
yes,
terms
you
of
sound
like,
better. Hello?
hello. Okay.
Yes, you sound
Am
better.
I now you're cutting off a little bit.
Okay, well,
Oh
I
my.
I promise you I have bits to spare, so I it's probably something on your end.
Yeah, technical issues are the worst. Okay. Um, so basically, I think the biggest misunderstanding is what exactly like our societies look like. I think I think if we're trying to attach yourself to a specific label and say, okay, capitalism has to be this ideology, and that train of thought to say, therefore, this is my position, we end up with a completely different position from what my original take is, right?
Hmm?
I'm just against the existence of a state, and I believe that people should voluntarily be able to associate how they want to, right?
Sure,
And
but
I believe
what does voluntary association mean to you?
essentially it means no coercion by a specific state, right? And I think implicit coercion is bound to happen, but I just don't see how an ANCOM society will fix that. Or sorry, how complete anarcho-communism will fix that, right? The existence of an ANCOM, a commune, or like a group of people who want to form an ANCOM society on their own, that's one thing. But like, if the entire world were ANCOM and there are people who don't want to associate with that, then they're being coerced into that.
What do you
So
wait, what does it mean to not want to associate with ANCOM?
I mean, you don't want to participate in a commune, right? You want to form
Oh, wait,
your
not
own
wait.
capitalistic
We have like
utopia.
7 billion people on Earth. ANCOM doesn't mean that everybody's going to live in a commune. Like, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to live in like a large flat with 4 or 5 or whatever people where they all share in doing the dishes. Like, you,
Oh, I mean,
you
that's not what I mean by commune, but okay, but
yeah,
like,
but you can be in an ANCOM society and live in a downtown flat or live in a ranch farmhouse somewhere out in the fucking boonies if you want to. It's not about where people live. It's about the economic and political organization that dictate the broader elements of how society functions.
What I mean is everyone. I don't think everyone needs to live in the same like. And okay, I want to describe to me what exactly an income world would look like. Because if you had maybe one society that operate like a commune, but the rest of the world believe in capitalism, then you still have a conflict of interest, right?
Well, I
Like
don't
I
think
just
that
don't see.
I don't think communism can be achieved non-globally. I think that's a transition that would need to take place globally.
Okay, so your argument is that anarcho-communism necessitates that the entire world is anarcho-communist, right? Because if there's certain people who don't want to participate in that anarcho-communistic system, then they're being forced into doing so. Because otherwise, if not everyone,
Well,
not the whole world
you
was
can make
communist,
this
then
argument about not wanting to participate in a system in any system. No matter what global system you have, there are always going to be people who don't want to participate in it but have no choice but to. Oh my god, I'm sorry, I clicked on a fucking TikTok video, my bad. That's always going to be the case, no matter what system, no matter how ethical or unethical. So the argument that some people wouldn't want to live in an ANCOM society isn't like, that's not really salient. That could be applied to literally any global government. The argument that I would make is that anarcho-communism, if that were to be the system that I would defend, which I guess it probably would be, is a system which people would, generally speaking, like quite a bit more to the alternatives. That capitalism is unethical and that anarcho-communism gives people more freedom and more personal choice than they would have otherwise.
okay. I mean, I think I can get behind that. Like I understand, I support co-ops, I support people, I support like market socialism to an extent, and I support all of those things. I just believe that people should voluntarily do so, right? Because I just otherwise believe that what you're left with is either a system that's not anarcho-communism, or it's a system in which everyone is forced to be an anarcho. I don't know.
Okay,
I
so
guess I'm
wait,
not as good at
say you
explaining
have a
this, but
capitalist country. So say you have a capitalist nation. How within that nation could you form an ANCOM society?
I'm kind of confused on what you're getting at because I
So
don't believe in
you're
there
saying that there's
in being
more
a nation.
implicit you're saying there's more implicit coercion in an ANCOM society because ANCOM societies won't allow capitalist societies to form, but a capitalist society would allow an ANCOM society to form. So I have to
Yeah,
ask you, how could any ANCOM society form under capitalism?
no, my argument isn't that capitalism should be around the world. I'm just saying I'm against the idea of ANCAP because what I mean by ANCAP is the lack of a state and people voluntarily free associating, right? So if you don't, if the whole, so like, okay, I'm trying to phrase this in a coherent
Anarcho-communism
way, but
certainly doesn't have a state.
yeah, but anarcho-communism, if you're talking about anarcho-communism, you yourself said that it has to happen on a global level, meaning that around the world all societies have to be anarcho-communist, right? Otherwise, it's not anarcho-communism. Is
Well, I
that
think
am I misinterpreting? Or?
anarcho-communism could exist like non-globally, but I think it would be unsustainable. The conflict between capitalist and non-capitalist societies would be counterproductive to the aims of both. I think it would be better to have a global socialist society that gradually transitions into a stateless, classless one over time.
Okay, so what you're implying is that the whole world has to be under an anarcho-communist system in order for anarcho-communism to even be possible. So if you don't, if certain people
long
don't
term,
want to
yes, I do think
participate,
that.
exactly. So there's certain people who don't want to be in an anarcho-communist society and they want to form their own capitalistic society. Then anarcho-communism doesn't allow for that because
Why would
under
it?
your own under your own premise, you say that if the entire world isn't anarcho-communist, then anarcho-communism isn't sustainable
Yeah,
at
but
all.
right
So
now
if
we
I
have
wanted
the
to go off and
right
start
now we
my own
have this with
capitalistic society,
capitalism. Right now, in
no,
a
because
on a capital. Wait.
you're
Where in
pivoting.
the
You're
world
pivoting.
today can you form a communist society without
No, okay,
being
I'm
destroyed
talking
by
about
capitalism?
Bosh. You're pivoting right now. You're pivoting because I was talking about your specific claim that the entire world has to be anarcho-communist
What,
in order for
but
anarcho-communism
right
to be
now the whole
sustainable.
world is
But that
capitalist.
implies. I'm not talking about right now. I'm talking
No,
about
wait. So
we're talking
the
about
issue is the
utopias.
thing you're describing also applies to capitalism.
I'm confused at what you're getting at because I was talking about our utopias, right?
Okay,
Like we're not talking
so
about the present day.
you're saying that that let's just say communist that a communist society there's a problem because in it people can't voluntarily decide to form a capitalist society, which to me sounds like saying democracies are bad because you can't voluntarily form a feudalist society within them. But whatever. But right now, today, in a global capitalist system, you can't just spontaneously form a communist country either, or a communist society.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I think
that
that, but
criticism applies to both capitalism and
okay,
communism.
but that
Neither
applies to state
system will
capitalism.
allow for iterations of its opposite to form within their borders.
But the capitalism you're referring to is modern day capitalism, which the only reason that is because there's a state that enforces that, right? But like if we got, because think about it, why can't I form an NCOM society?
So wait, no,
Well,
hold on. So wait, I want to follow you in this train of logic. So say we got rid of modern flawed capitalism and we had stateless anarcho-capitalism the world over. How would anyone
okay,
form a communist society?
they find a chunk of land that isn't already being occupied, and
What
then
chunk of
find people.
what
But
chunk
like
of
they
land
find
wouldn't
people
already
who,
be owned?
I mean, like land that isn't currently being owned, right?
But
I mean,
land
like
is
you're
all land on Earth
because
is
you're
already
taking a hypothetical scenario and then you're asking
no.
specifics about that.
Well, no,
But
no, no, no,
we're
no.
talking
These
purely
are very
hypotheticals.
simple questions. So right now, all usable land on Earth is already owned. The only land on Earth that is not currently owned by some entity already are probably chunks of Antarctica, and there are like transnational treaties which dictate how that land is split up. You also
Okay, but
have
who's that land
asteroids
owned
and other
by?
celestial bodies. So on Earth, how are you ever just going to find a chunk of land that isn't already owned? Like, why would there
Okay,
be
that's fair. I
unowned
mean,
land?
okay, another way to go about it is like suppose you see people who occupy a certain area, and then you want to convince the lead, like whoever owns that area, that you want to form it into an income society. Or let's say like you find,
Why
I
would a
mean, in this,
business owner ever be
okay, but like
persuaded by
I
that?
don't think this criticism is unique to anarcho capitalism, because like under an income society, how would like
No, but I
okay
but I have to
okay
ask you
I'm
that.
kind
So
of confused
because your
about,
wait,
okay.
because your system is equally incapable of accepting its alternative. Why would a business owner ever just go like, yeah, I cede all this territory so you can have a free commune on it? Like, why would that ever happen?
I mean, the sense of like if certain people occupy land believe they're being treated unjustly, they can have a revolution against whoever's in charge of the land,
Wait,
because there's no state to stop that from happening, right?
wait,
I
wait, wait,
mean, like
wait. So you said that it's bad in ANCOM societies because they won't allow capitalist societies to form. But now you're saying that in order to form a communist society under an ANCAP society, they would need a revolution. Isn't that the exact same thing? Like you're saying we would need to use violence to secure territory. How is that any
okay, so I want to
different?
ask you, how would you form an income society to begin with?
Well,
Because like in
you
any
would need like
circumstance,
a
because you need
global
a
socialist
revolution.
society that would like sort of collectively set in motion systems that would begin to fade away the borders and
because
decommodify the remnants of the economy.
because to move from the status quo to another society, you require the change, right? Which oftentimes comes to a revolution. So like, I just don't understand how your critique is unique to anarcho-capitalism, because
Well,
under an
no, wait,
income society, if I
it's
wanted to
not.
form,
The only critique that I'm challenging right now is you said that ANCOM societies were coercive because they don't allow for capitalism. I think the capitalist societies don't allow for communist societies. So in this case, your system, anarcho-capitalism, is equally coercive in the respect that it doesn't allow for antagonistic systems to form within it.
not necessarily, because here's the thing:
Then how could you
you
form an
said that an
ANCOM
income
society in a
you
in an
can't
ANCAP?
form a complete, under your definition, we can't form an income society, because your definition of income society requires the entire world to be an income
No, no, no,
in
no,
an
no, no, no.
income
You could no,
system,
no.
right?
I
Because
think that
if
the
I want
only
to
way
form
a
a commune,
sustainable ANCOM society could exist is if it's the entire world. If we want to talk about like a small pocket, and I think the same about capitalism, by the way. If you want to talk about a small pocket, how could you form a pocket of anarcho-communism within an ANCAP society?
well, in an active society, like if you're making the assumption that like every single part of land has to be owned by some
No, like
mega lord,
how could you get
but
anything, like anything at all? How could you get any territory upon which to build an anarcho-communist society?
well, I mean, let's say we do live in Ancapistan, right? I mean, think about like the Native Americans. How did the tribes find their area to live and
They weren't
make?
capitalists. They were primitive communists. They didn't even have businesses the way we understand them. In an
But I don't.
ANCAP
But
society, like the world would be owned and split up by megacorps. Like we know that would happen. How would any group of people be able to achieve an ANCOM society?
I mean, in the sense of like when you find an open chunk of land, you get a group of people who are willing to participate in that,
What
right?
open
I feel
chunk
like
of land?
because you're
What land wouldn't be owned? Right now in
you're putting on the
America,
premise
all land
a
is
premise that like the entire world would be monopolized already
this isn't
under an ANCAP
this
society, but
isn't
that
wait,
doesn't necessarily happen.
this isn't the 1500s. There aren't open chunks of land anymore. Like
Wait, so I want to go back to like because one of your premises, I want to talk about your premise here that the all land will be owned by some monopolizing entity,
right
right?
now, all land on Earth is owned already. That's already happened.
But I would argue that's because of a state, because state allows for monopolies to continue. What happens if you remove the state? Well, how do monopolies even form?
Where would there be open land in a world where everything is anarcho-capitalist? Like, what chunk of usable land wouldn't be instantly homesteaded by a corporation?
But how can a corporation just homestead a bunch of land and not use it for anything and keep on their monopoly?
That's
How does
because
that work,
they
right?
already
Because like,
do that, and they do it by hiring guards.
okay, but even then, people who feel that's unjust can, fight the guards and take back the land, right?
Yeah,
There's no one,
just
there's no
war
state
against
stopping them from
wait,
doing that.
wait. So your solution is everyone just fight and die all the time to like over petty
Well, not
land
all the
disputes?
time, because I don't believe because your argument requires the premise that all land is occupied in the first place.
The idea that there would be
were no
open,
state, right?
usable land in any
But here's the thing,
society
because
is delusional. That's not happening. The land's owned already. Everything
But
is
you're
owned.
making the premise, you're making the assumption that someone had to have gotten the land and been able to sustain that for so long in order for there to be
All
conflict
land is
all the
already
time.
owned.
But how would someone acquire a piece of land in the first place, right? If I try
Without
to
a
go and take
state,
someone else's
there's no
land,
such thing as just territory. You just secure it. The state is what
not
protects
necessarily because
private.
someone.
Well, okay,
Not really,
what
because
determines
if
who
people
owns a piece of land? What determines that?
whoever can get their hands on it, whoever has more power.
Okay,
But
so
here's the thing:
So
if an individual is keeping, is hoarding a huge chunk of land, then oftentimes others are just going to come and take them out of power, right? Or
yeah,
like they can.
you're describing feudalism. You're describing chaos and death over land feuds, where different corporations hire thousands of poor people to fight wars on borders for them,
But here's
so
the
they
thing,
can
what's the
define
incentive for that
corporate
to happen in the
territory.
first place?
This is your utopia?
Not really. My utopia is where everyone has an individual area of land where no one else treads on it, right? And like if I want to protect my chunk of land, if someone tries to steal it,
What if
I
they,
could fight to keep my territory. But what's the
what if
incentive?
it's a corporation?
You're assuming that everyone is perpetually motivated to get as much land as possible.
Yeah,
I don't always think
yes,
it's the case.
capitalism is literally predicated on an assumption of perpetual growth. Why would a corporation not just take your land? They've been doing this for centuries.
You're using a definition. I'm not saying that. Like, how would that? I want to go and conquer every single piece of land in the world.
So your society's survival is predicated on the hope that vastly more powerful entities than you will just accept having less rather than conquering more,
how
in
do
stark
people
defiance
become
of
vastly more
all of
powerful
human
then?
history.
Wait. How do people become vastly more powerful? That's my question. Because let's go back to your analogy with because I feel like this is
I need you to answer these questions. So your system to prevent the way people become more powerful is by taking things. Back in primitive accumulation days, the way the Western powers were able to grow so strong is because we used a combination of military might and mercantilist corporations to rape the rest of the planet. All of human history has been about people with power without restrictions taking everything they can. There has never been an empire that just decided, we're big enough. That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So why would corporations...
How do they keep their power, right?
Why would corporations not just eat up your house? Like, why wouldn't they just eat up all the territory they could?
What would they do with my house? Like, how would they keep being able to get more and more and more houses, right? How would they get that?
They could bulldoze it. They could put a shop up there. They could bulldoze it and replace it with something more profitable, or they could cut it in half and for twice the price and half the land, they could turn it into a corporate town, and they could use your house to house the employees of their local factory.
Wait, well, what happens when they can no longer keep buying these things? Because this money relies on others voluntarily giving the money to do that, right? They have to be selling some product, or they have to be doing some service in exchange for some wealth.
They turn your house, they turn it into an efficient unit of economic production, and then they sell it back to other people who have already been conquered.
How do they have the money to buy my house in the first place, right? You're assuming that people can just continuously keep getting wealth. But if I'm greedy and I keep fucking with other people's territory, then no one's gonna want to buy stuff from me anymore, right? Because
Wait, no, come on. Wait, you really think? Wait, you think people will boycott corporations in an ANCAP society? What if the corporation owns the territory you live on? What, you're just going to not buy water? They'll shut off the water to your house, my dude. What if you live on, like, you realize most, like, Americans rent, right? Like, if your territory is already owned by a corporation, if you speak out against them, they'll just shut off your water. That can be part of the preconditions in the tenancy lease that you signed. It's not like there's a state to review these contracts, after all. Like, if you boycott them, they just shut off your water. They'll kick you out. There are other people who need that house.
I mean, so your argument is that, like, they're going to come to my house and basically take me out of there and take my water, but there's going to be water in other areas, right? It rains all the time. There are going to be
you're going to drink rainwater?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be water somewhere, right? Like, in the sense of,
sure, like, okay, then you can be kicked out, and you can go live in the forest, and you can drink rainwater off the fronds of big plants. What about, like, how does that affect the corporation? Another person has already moved into your apartment. But here's the thing,
who's going to volunteer? Well, here's the thing. Your argument is that the corporation's going to keep being able to get more and more people to buy their water. But if there's other sources of water, then that monopoly doesn't last for long at all. Where do you think
water comes from? The water we drink comes from reservoirs and from lakes that are privately owned. Where else are you going to get water from? Do you think the whole world is just going to drink rainwater?
Well, because by the time that enough people stop buying into the corporation's bullshit, they're going. What do you mean? The corporation's
you
not
live on the corporation's property.
The
police officers in your area are employed by the corporation. Your food is branded by the corporation. What are you going to do to rebel against them? There's no other authority to appeal to.
I mean, you just move out of their territory, right?
What if they just shoot you for trying to move out? What if they do some fucking Berlin Wall shit and it's like, hey, you want to leave our territory? Fuck you. You were born here. This is where you are.
I mean, at that point, we're no longer under ANCAP because that essentially becomes a government or a state, right?
Yeah, that's the point. States are inevitable unless you form decommodified systems that can replace them. Corporations will just form feudal states. Like, what would prevent them from doing that? Why wouldn't they? It's the soundest and most stable, like, way of developing your power. All power relations trend towards equilibrium. The equilibrium for the society you describe is feudalism. That's why humanity lived under feudalism for thousands of years. It's a stable system. You have complete autocracy with decentralized ownership collected in the hands of the aristocracy or a managerial board.
I mean, I guess that's fair. Like, but I just want to know how ANCAP is sustainable too, right? Because I'm not because I can be convinced, but I just want to understand what happens when people stop wanting to, be a part of the commune. What happens when people
does it mean to be a part of the commune? Like, what are they missing out on?
You're talking about how. So, like, earlier in the call, you were talking about how each worker would be incentivized to collectively own a share in whatever,
they would make democratic decisions about whatever economic system they were a part of. Yeah. So if they worked at a factory, they would make democratic decisions about what they produced and what to do with that production. If they lived at a coffee or worked at a coffee shop, they'd do work there. I mean, yeah,
Okay, sure, but what does that mean? Everyone in the business or whatever entity there is has equal amount of power, or are some people going to have more of a say, right? Because, like, if we're trying to make a decision about what's the most economically sound thing to do, and I'm an economist or I'm a mathematician and no one else is, like, why should everyone else's voice have the same amount of credibility as mine, right?
Well, it wouldn't. Like, I mean, it's democracy doesn't mean all voices get equal credence. If the democratic decision is where should we direct our water supply, I don't think, for example, that, like, the 5 engineering workers should get equal weight to, like, the city planner. Obviously, like, management has to be stratified in such a way that people have responsibility over different jobs, but we have that today. America is a democracy. It's a very fucked up one, but it is a democracy. And in America, we don't referendum every single issue where every single thing is done on first past the post,
But what's happening is Oh, sorry.
We delegate some issues to experts, which is probably good. I don't know if people can handle voting on hyper-complicated trade policy. I'm not entirely sure if that would be a good way of, like, fixing social problems. Not every person can be an expert.
But isn't that the entire point that, like, ANCAP is trying to go against the idea of, like, centralized power in the hands of a few? What you're doing is you're giving it to the few people who are going to make the decisions, right? Like in the sense of like there's just someone in charge of like making the final orchestrating
on
the decision. You know
appropriate
what I mean?
issues, it's fine. I'm okay with medical decisions being made by medical experts. I'm okay with like climate change related issues being deferred to climatology experts. Like there's a big difference between power consolidated in the way that like an autocracy does and power consolidated in the hands of experts who are specialized in the specific subject that's being discussed. Like that's a really big difference, you know. The hierarchy of expertise is a valid hierarchy. What else is the point of knowing more?
Yeah, true. I mean, but I guess the biggest contention I see is how is it that sustainable in the long run, right? Who's going to stop me from maybe dominating my workers or
How would you
taking, you know,
dominate them?
part? Like, let's say there's. I'm trying to think of like specifically how an income society would even look, right? Well, what would the institutions look like? How would who would be in charge of keeping it together, right? Like, unless there's some sort of a state or some sort of a governing entity,
Well,
who's
there
going
would be
to
a governing
be
entity.
what's the cohesive
Cooperative
or what's the
ownership.
cohesive force?
Cooperative ownership is a government. Let's say it's an anarcho-syndicalist society. You have an overlapping collection of essentially mega unions that are democratically voted on with striating tiers of participation in workers' councils, and collectively they kind of decide all the major things in society. They do it through stratified liquid democracy, and it's a system by which we figure out most of the major problems in society without any kind of central authority. You know, you have like a syndicate that's tasked to like social organization, and you have a syndicate that's tasked towards like material production and distribution, and so on and so forth. Like, say that. How would you and why would you revolt against this?
I mean, I guess that's I would personally like that, but like suppose someone else was greedy and they wanted more than just to be a part of maybe like one syndicate, right?
But
They
what would they
wanted to own
do?
a syndicate. They wanted to own two syndicates.
Well, nobody
I
would
mean,
own it. I mean, they would just be a part. They would be like a voter in one or both of them. But like, what do you mean? Like, what would they do? Like, how would they do that? How would they achieve that power?
I guess if everyone else in the society is convinced, and if I was the only one who wanted to do that, then I guess everyone else could stop me. But like, let's say, like, but everyone still needs to be willing to participate in the system, right? If you look at it on a systemic level, everyone needs to vote in these decision making process. Everyone needs to cooperate, right? Do you get where I'm coming from here? Like
Sure, but
everyone
in a
needs to be a part of
capitalism,
the
everyone
system.
has to work. I mean, that's all systems require some degree of like coercive cooperation. Obviously, we can't have a society where people have absolutely no like degree of levied engagement with the world they live in. But how would you how would you get people to revolt? Like,
I mean,
what would the
like
motivation be? Like, what are they lacking?
I guess if the society does work out well, I'm fine with it. I mean, I guess the biggest contention I had is people being forced into just voting in a syndicate or like not being able to own their own land. But I see how like it could be a problematic the other way around.
Well, they could. I mean, they can abstain from voting. I'm not suggesting like like complicit voting or anything. Like,
Mhm.
but if they're a good member of their like local syndicate or of their union or whatever, then they probably should be participating. If they don't want to, they don't have to, I guess. But
So there's, I'm guessing you're in favor of a market system, right? Where you, I thought you were more of a mutualist, or are you
I
anti?
think
I'm just wondering where you stand, just
I,
'cause, like,
I think there are some elements of society where market economies are ethical and functional, and that the market economy is just seems to be like a fact of the universe. Supply and demand just seems to be a fact of the universe. The best thing that we can do is stratify society to make sure that our market systems are as ethical and as functional as possible, which I
that I
think is
can
totally
understand.
possible.
I
Yeah.
mean, then once again, I said I'm pro co-op and pro all that.
Right,
I mean,
right. But again, like my issue is that in a society that's truly democratized, like a communist one, what would the impetus be for a revolution? Like, what would you be trying to take that you could get? There isn't like a power structure for you to seize. Everything is democratized. You can't accumulate wealth and use power that way. The only thing you could really do is like democratically convince thousands of other people that you would be better as a supreme leader or
yeah, that's
something.
fair.
Yeah,
But
but like I
okay,
mean that's a pretty hard sell, you know? Like
on the
vote me
premise
in,
that
I'll
so
take
so
control.
so Vosh, here's the deal, right? On the premise that we already somehow established a society this way, I think it would be pretty stable. But how do we get there, right? Like, I mean, Marxism relies on a centralized, like state worker state in order to get there. But that would mean, centralized power in the hands of a few, which would lead to
Well,
more problems, right? But
a
like,
worker's
or
state
if we,
a worker's state or a dictatorship of the proletariat literally just means a state which serves the interests of the proletariat. It doesn't mean that it's autocracy. It could be a democracy. It could be extremely democratic, more democratic than America. It could be a liquid democracy, you know?
but
With
in reality, how well does that work out, right? Because you're still giving the power to rule over a certain area, right? It's still a state in the sense of it's going to have a military, it's going to have state-run institutions, it's going to have all that, and that means giving power to the hands of a few. And why would they be incentivized to look out for the workers when those who have more like I just don't understand. Like when you revolution, like let's say you have a revolution and you take the means of you seize the means of production, like how would you form a worker state, and who gets to decide who is in charge of that worker
well,
state?
the goal would
Who
be
gets
to
to make the decisions?
democratize the economy and then democratize. Well, I mean, it's a democracy. The person who would make the decision was the person who was elected, right? Or the people who were
Yeah, sure,
elected.
but how do you get there? Like who decides? Who gets like who organizes the democracy?
I don't know what you mean. The bourgeois are overthrown, and then a new constitution is chartered, right? I mean, there's not like a one. You don't like press a button and there's an instant transition. And there are a million ways it could go down. But like we have already made democracies from nothing. We wrote the Constitution. It's not a great document, but it's probably better than what England was
That's
at the
true.
time. Yeah.
That's been
So
done.
yeah, it's possible to like make these big shifts. You just need the power to secure that transition. We were able to do so back in 1776 because we were far away from England and we had a lot of, we had a lot of patriots within our borders. And if we ever arrived at a point in a country where they felt they had sufficient internal and external support for a workers' revolution, or honestly, even for a peaceful power grab, if it was possible, that'd be
Yeah.
ideal, I guess. Then they could ratify a new constitution, which secures hands in the power of the working class, eliminates the bourgeois and capitalism as we understand it. And then from that point forward, it's just a matter of securing the democratic processes to achieve socialism.
Well, in that case, but that would be fine. But in the modern day, I just don't see how it's possible. Like the amount of nukes, and the amount of militarized power the government has is insane. Like unless we can somehow get rid of all of that from the people in power, like how do we do that?
Well, the goal would be democracy, right? I mean, that's the thing. Like, we can't war against the United States. Nobody could win against the United States. The goal would be
Yeah.
to slowly weaken the capitalists within our country, to secure allies abroad, and to eventually reach a point where a majority of the people within our country are supportive of radical propositions which destabilize or delegitimize the bourgeois. If the bourgeois then retaliate with some attempted coup or like a worker or like a business plot as they attempted to back in the 1920s or whatever, then in that case, they are the aggressors and they are acting not
Okay.
necessarily with the permission of the United States military. The military, all they have to do is step to the side as we finish the work, after all. The bourgeois on their own are what? How many hundreds, how many thousands of wealthy people? They're nothing compared to us, not in numbers. If the
Well,
military is sufficiently
okay.
sympathetic to the cause of the proletariat, then after that, it's just a matter of dealing with their antagonism, and then we win.
But like you're still relying on you're saying you want to go about it through electoralism and democratizing and like better policy pass that supports the interests of the working class. If I'm understanding correctly, it still relies on the willingness of politicians to cooperate. But how can we do that, right? Because
What do
politicians
you
are
mean? What do you
easily
mean
swayed by money.
politicians cooperate?
I mean, politicians like seek to pass policies that are in the interests of the working class, right? In order to
Well, I would
have
like
more
them to.
democratizations. Yeah, but how is that really possible when they're more incentivized to serve the interests of the wealthy, right? They're receiving like the working class can't pay
Well,
them as
that's
much as a
yeah,
super rich
that's the
billionaire can, right?
dialectic. You move the general population further and further left, they vote in more left-leaning people, and as the antagonism grows more clear, the fact that we keep voting in left-leaning people, but it's with the government keeps ignoring like the push towards the left, the greater that antagonism is, the more likely it is that we can take advantage of that for um, uh, agitative sentiment. That we can take advantage of that in some way. Um, I think reformism is only useful insofar as it's a tool that can radicalize the working class. But beyond that point, I don't think the bourgeois are going to give up their power willingly. It would be nice if they
Yeah,
did,
of
though.
course.
It's not impossible that they do. It is conceivable that they see the writing on the wall. They say, okay, fine, and they go build some island fortress to live on for the rest of their lives. That's not impossible. It would be nice if they did that.
Yeah, of course, but
Right.
oh well. But here's the thing, though. Like even then, like you need to stop lobbying, right? Because you're still relying on politicians serving like the interests of the people. Like let's say I vote in, some politician who says that they're going to, um, they're going to institute universal health care. They're going to establish a minimum wage, do all these like progressive policies.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, they just don't do it, right? Because like how would you ensure that they actually do what they say they're going to do? Because there's no incentive for the because people who already have power, this relies on them giving up their power voluntarily to other people. I think it goes back to like a similar analogy, like when a person who owns a piece of land, like you can't just convince them to give the land to the people who live in it, right?
Well, if there's a
Like
democratic process that secures the transition of power from one individual to another, you can defer to legal institutions to secure their removal. We're doing that with Trump right now. If Trump could, he would absolutely stay in office, but the
of course, I mean,
institutions are stronger than him. And as long as we continue to secure those institutions, and as long as we use them to the best of our ability, there is headway that can be made electorally. For example, lobbying, probably can't get rid of it entirely, but we can certainly legislate around it. There are things we can do, changes that we can make, and we know these are things we can make because there are European countries who are better at handling this stuff than we are. These changes are essential on the path towards revolution. So
yeah.
we should do what we can now. And if we feel that that agitation is boiling up in the future, then we can talk about.
But you can only get so far through electoralism, right? Because
Yeah, of
many of
course.
these European nations, they're passing policies. There's parties that are actively trying to get rid of. Like I think you talked about this with Denims, I think yesterday, but they're actively trying to get rid of these progressive policies that they've already put forth. So
Mhm.
like stock them is just like a temporary, positive change, which is just going to be reverted by those in power again. So like the only way you can do it is to somehow convince the politicians to be completely sympathetic to the working class
Well,
somehow.
you don't convince the politicians. The further left you move the population, the more left-leaning people you can elect into office. Like so there are limits on the extent to which they can fuck with the system. If every American, every single one of them, went ahead and voted for like who's like a super left-leaning, I don't know, Mike Gravel, some very very left-leaning politician, like
Mhm.
they wouldn't just ignore that. Like they can't just ignore that. The ruling class can't go like, Jeb Bush won, woo! Like it doesn't work that
Yeah.
way. Our system does allow for some pushback from the working people. It's not great, but it's a little bit. Like there are so many thousands, tens of thousands of people involved in this process, and you have to understand the vast majority of the legwork is done by the proletariat. This is the case for the military too. It may seem like people at the top are making decisions, but they stand atop a very tall and rickety ladder. In reality, most of the groundwork for anything done by the ruling class is actually laid by the tens of thousands of people beneath them, people sympathetic, hopefully, to the needs of the working class. And
That's
those
fair.
ruling class people know that. So if the public will is strong enough, change can happen. It's just a matter of pushing people in that direction.
Okay, I mean, and I don't disagree with you here. I just want to kind of play devil's advocate because I just want to convince. I'm kind of cognitively dissonant, as you might have seen this whole time. Like I'm not even fully attached to a position. I just want to understand why I should commit all the way, right, to whatever ideology
Mhm.
that to any ideology really. But like, so let's say you're saying that somehow the military should be sympathetic to the working people because otherwise if they turn against the people, we're pretty much fucked. So we need to somehow get the military sympathetic to our interests. But what if like the government or whoever's in power sees whatever is happening, right? This antagonism, and they try to push more like policies to maybe get them more sympathetic with the bourgeoisie, right? Maybe increase the salaries of military people or privilege people who work in the military
Yeah,
over other people.
that's a thing that's happened historically. Usually leaders, like especially back in the days of the monarchy, when they felt threatened, they would start upping the salaries of their private army. That's a pretty common thing. Even if it meant starving their population, the people who got fed were the soldiers. And the reason they did that is because they knew the angrier the peasantry got, the more they were going to need to rely on the soldiers not turning around and stabbing the king. That is a thing that has happened, and yet monarchies are mostly gone from the world. I think the fact
Yeah.
remains that at this point, our economy and our society are decentralized enough that it would be very difficult to move the military in that way. A military man is not just the sum of their training. They went to school, they had friends, they have family, they got shipped off, and they may hold their opinions. The majority, by the way, of soldiers today voted for Biden, those soldiers who voted at least.
Yeah,
And
that's surprising to me actually.
police
But
trend in favor of Trump, military in favor of Biden for a bunch of really interesting reasons. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it is true that there are some people in the military, I'm sure, who could be swayed easily by that kind of cynical attempt at leveraging their power. I don't know how effective it would be, how reliably it would be effective. I mean, in the long term, I have
yeah,
some faith in the way our system works.
and I mean that's why I'm partly like I know this might seem kind of like a non sequitur, but I'm pro gun, right? I think that the state shouldn't have a monopoly on violence, even if there does exist a state.
Mhm.
And like I do believe, like of course, like 100 people with even like AK-47s or whatever, they have no bearing on the U.S. military, and that's probably a common argument used by anti-gun people who want to say, oh, like any attempt to shoot any government official is going to result in failure because the government has so much more power. But one thing they don't realize is that like you have to somehow like use like how, let's think about it. Like so let's say like I was being assaulted by a police officer and I decide to shoot the officer. Like at that point, like what use is the government's power if I'm just in a small individual interaction with some state agent? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
I
Well,
kind of feel like we have power in numbers too.
a government is the sum of its parts. It's true that there's no force on earth that could withstand the United States military. So that remains the case. But yeah, I don't think it would ever come to that, frankly. Or at least if handled well, I don't think it would come to that. I need to head and finish up donations before I have an appointment. Are there any final memes that you want to hit on?
No, of course, I'll say trans rights. I'm very socially progressive. I don't really like. Yeah, I mean, I guess whatever other memes. Thank you for the good talk. I'd like to say I'm hopefully good faith. I don't want to come off as like too like ideology or
You are
whatever.
called Good Faith ANCAP, so I mean,
Exactly, I call myself that for a reason, right? I'm pretty sure the chat's memeing me. It's okay. I'm pretty new to politics and stuff. I saw ANCAP ideology. I thought it was like pretty cool, and I wanted to learn more about it. I thought it was really nice, but I don't know. I'm kind of really cognitively dissonant. I'm leading. I don't know where I lean right now. I'm just trying to figure stuff out. But yeah, thank you very much.
of course, and I'm glad that we have a shared appreciation for freedom. Be well.
Of course. Be well.
Okay, that was a nice kid. Can I say kid? That was kid, right? Yeah, nice kid. I think that conversation went well.